Today I want to visit with you about using glyphosate as a tool in our prairie plantings where we have introduced species showing up. And this is a tool that we can utilize in the fall. We're taking advantage of the fact that our prairie plants, they go dormant where a lot of our introduced species do not, just like your bluegrass yard, and how green it is as we go into winter. So those species that often can give us some problems in the prairie could be smooth bromegrass, bluegrass, reed canary grass, and our introduced legumes could be a real problem. So this is a tool that we can use to try to kill them out and not hurt our prairie. Now, when we use a tool like this, it's not for those new seedings. Those new seedings of a prairie, when they're getting established, they go dormant later in the fall. So we really want to work on our prairie after about 3 growing seasons. If it's a new seeding, we want well-established plants. And this can be a tool then that if we have some issues that we can utilize. So one of the first things we want to do when we're using this tool is really know what we have out there. We want to evaluate that prairie stand that we've got. Take a good look at it. What do we have for introduced species? Because those species that we have, that dictates what that rate of glyphosate is going to be needed. And so fescue, reed canary, it takes a higher rate to kill that than it does bromegrass and bluegrass. Introduced legumes can be difficult to kill. So it's really important that we look at that label so that we're getting the right rate on there. And we also want to look at the spray adjuvants. It can be really important when we're using herbicides. And so for a case of glyphosate, using some AMS, ammonium sulfate, we'd like to have that in the tank. But you need to look at that label, and then you'll know how much to put in and figuring out that rate we're going to apply. So one of the things I also want you to think about when we're evaluating our stand out there, and we've got some of these introduced problems, is think about how do we get there? What caused them to come into the stand? Was it because we started with a perennial plant community and we had a transition then to go to prairie and we just didn't adequately terminate what was there? Is it a problem to where we did a pollinator seeding and we didn't have very high grass component, and maybe we used a lot of the warm season short grass prairie, and that can leave us an opening for getting some of these problems in? Or maybe it's just a seed bank that's bringing these introduced species back into it. But we do want to evaluate that, because the part of the solution is to terminate them and get them out of there. But the next part of that solution may be that we've got to add diversity to the stand. So we really need to look at that stand of prairie that we have. And if we've got pretty good diversity and we're just knocking this stuff out, the prairie will fill those holes in. But if we don't have as good a diversity as we feel we need, if we don't have maybe the tall grass component in there, then it's a good time to add that diversity back into that stand after we get this termination of these introduced species with glyphosate. So when we think about the recipe for this strategy, what we like to do, we like to wait till October. So some of our prairie plants are already dormant. Our tall warm season grasses are certainly dormant, but we're still having some forbs out there that are green. Some of your asters and different forbs are still going to be green. So we like to come out in October and we like to mow. So we're going to mow that area. And so if some of those forbs were still growing at that point and we mow them, then they'll go into dormancy. Now, when we mow, mowing height can be a little bit, if we mow really low, we're going to be a little more assured that we're not going to hurt those existing forbs that we're still growing. But it does mean that we got to have regrowth. And so that could be a little more challenging in October, but we're going to wait a couple weeks and get some regrowth. And then we're going to come in there and then we're going to do a spray application of glyphosate. And you'll notice, like behind me, the size of the projects will dictate kind of what you're going to use for spraying equipment. And, you know, small projects, you can get down to a backpack sprayer, ATV sprayer, or what we have there is a 12-foot, 30-gallon, 12-foot boom, on the smaller projects. When you get into the bigger projects, you're going to want a bigger sprayer, and a lot of folks are going to go to the custom applicator, to the ag business, and have them apply that chemical. But it can be a challenge sometimes. You're going to want to visit with them. That time of year, a lot of their sprayers have already been winterized. So they may not want to come out and do an October spray. And if you're doing your own spraying, it can be challenging because, you're trying to pick the windows out when we have the right temperatures. And you certainly can't have chemical and water in your tanks when we're getting below freezing at night. But with that said, we are really trying to wait for some regrowth. And then we want our highs ideally to get to 60 degrees or higher. And we don't want our lows to really get less than 40 degrees. So we're kind of looking for an ideal window, ideally maybe 5 days, to where they're getting some good growth. We come in there and we get it sprayed, and we're spraying midday, ideally when it's sunny, and they're getting a couple of good days of growth after we spray. And so what we're doing is that glyphosate is getting inside of that plant. And we want it to get in there, and then it translocates down into the roots. Fall is a really good time to kill perennial plants, because a perennial plant in the fall, before it becomes dormant, is taking its nutrients from the top and bringing it down into the root system. So when it's doing that, when we do that chemical, it translocates with those nutrients down into the roots and really helps us to get a good kill. So that's ideally kind of the time temperature range we're looking for. Now, if we don't get that mowing done in October, then what we really need to do is wait till November. And by doing that, we're just trying to be more sure that most of those prairie plants are dormant. And then we're going to spray right over the top. Now, there's some disadvantages to that. By mowing, we're going to get really good contact on that growth underneath of those introduced plants. And so when we're spraying over the top, we're going to have a lot of dead plant, dormant plant material, and the chemicals kind of got to get down through there. But it's certainly a lot easier than doing the mowing, just to do the spray. But we'll probably be a little less effective on getting the kill we want, just due to how well we're contacting those introduced species. And we're up here at Lehigh, Iowa, visiting with Bill Johnson with Iowa DNR, kind of a go-to prairie expert. So what are some of the introduced problems you guys have that you find in the prairie plantings up here?
So we have a number of introduced issues, introduced pest species, I guess. Reed canary grass by far is probably the biggest problematic species for us, but even things like smooth brome, Birdsfoot Trefoil, there's a number of native grasses or non-native grasses and non-native legumes that are problematic to us for prairie management.
So when you've got those in the stand, what would you say is kind of a recipe to go ahead, and when you're going to go ahead and spray glyphosate? You're starting with a mow typically?
Yeah. So ideally, if we can, it's bale and remove, mow, bale and remove, because then that leaves no residue at all. So when you come in and apply the herbicide this time of year, so after a good killing frost, 3-4 days a week after a good killing frost, you get good contact with the green reed canary grass that's 6 inches to a foot high. Many times what happens is big blue stem is 5-6 foot high, and there's no way to get that herbicide down to that pest species that we're trying to kill. And so baling, removing, you can just mow it and let the mowed material naturally decay into the ground, and the reed canary grass come up through that too, and that works just fine. But you probably have to give it a little more time, say mow late September, early October for that.
And then you're going to wait 2-3 weeks to get some of that regrowth to come back up through the duff.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
So now we're getting towards the end of October. So when you're spraying at this point and this late in the fall, what kind of temperatures and stuff are you shooting for?
Temperature doesn't really make a difference other than above freezing, because it makes spraying a lot easier. But that should make a difference. The key is that when you look down, you have green material that you're applying that herbicide to. As long as it's green, that means it's actively growing. And when it's actively growing this time of year, the great thing is it takes that herbicide in and translocates it to its roots very well, because that's naturally what that plant's doing anyway, taking all that energy from those green leaves, putting it back into the roots for the winter, and it does a really good job of killing that plant.
So we're spraying here the end of October, and so we've got colder temps. Are we going to see what we've sprayed? How long does it take to show the effect?
So that's really difficult, because it does rely on temperature. If it's really cool and stays cool, you may not see actual results until next spring. But keep in mind, with that herbicide being translocated to the roots, effectively you get a better kill of the plant and the rhizomes at the same time by fall application versus spring application. Both work, but that's one of the benefits of fall application. They're taking all that energy from those leaves, putting it to its roots. So in the summertime, where you may see results of glyphosate application in 3 days to a week, this time of year it may be 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or you may not see it because it gets so cold. You may not see it until next spring. So
reed canary grass is a little harder to control than brome and bluegrass. Where you've got those infestations, are you typically kind of doing back-to-back years of doing this spraying, or do you find 1 year gets you pretty good results?
So with reed canary grass control, if it's in a good existing prairie where there's good existing diversity, you can spray in the fall and get rid of a lot of the reed canary grass. If you got good diversity there, then you may get some good regrowth and have it successfully keep that reed canary grass out. I would be a little skeptical and think that you either need to overseed that area with a good wet mix, or follow it up with a spring application of Select Max. I try to think of a
kind of a grass selective herbicide.
A grass selective herbicide, yeah. I can't say the active ingredient in that particular.
Yeah, and when we use grass select herbicides, for some reason reed canary grass seems a little more susceptible to that than maybe some other grasses. Or do you think? I mean, I look at reed canary grass as very difficult to control, and I'm very surprised that these grass selective herbicides give it much of a hit.
Yeah. So the benefit of the back-to-back treatment is you're killing the mother plant in the fall, and then if you go ahead and apply a second time in the spring, then you're getting all those rhizomes that you missed that were laying dormant underneath the soil, and so it's kind of a double whammy on controlling reed canary grass. And yeah, it does a really good job of controlling reed canary grass. Even if it does not kill it, it keeps it suppressed long enough that the natives are able to express themselves and get established and hopefully get ahead of that reed canary grass problem species. So
when you look at coming in on a reed canary area where you don't feel like you've got the diversity of prairie plants there, so what kind of species are you wanting to get started in that area that you think will compete?
So I like species like sawtooth sunflower, goldenrod species, whether it's stiff goldenrod, grassleaf goldenrod, Riddell's goldenrod. All those do really well. Things like ironweed, all of them are pretty early successional, don't take a long time to establish. And with the goldenrods, I think it is also beneficial because it has a little allelopathic effect on grasses, goldenrods do. So I think they're actually beneficial too. Things like cordgrass, obviously, that one holds its own against reed canary grass. So if you can put in cordgrass too, it's a little longer term to get established. But once established, that one can compete with reed canary grass on its own. So.
Before we leave, you mentioned a lot of forbs. Cut plant, would that be another one?
Cut plant would be another excellent one.
Okay.
And I think with cut plant, one of the things is it's so tall, it shades out reed canary grass.
Okay.
And so there's an extra advantage with cut plant too. So yeah, a lot of those good mesic moist species that we have in the prairie. I just gave a few examples. Try to get some that were really early successful, easy to establish. And like
somewhat kind of aggressive.
And somewhat aggressive.
I mean, some of those species you may not want so much of, maybe
in the whole prairie, but in that problematic area, it may be what you actually want there.
So when you look at prairie cordgrass and trying to get that established, can you tell me when you like to seed that? Or are you using plugs or seed? Because that's a hard one for us to establish.
So if you're planting prairie cordgrass, you want to plant it dormantly, definitely. I believe, I know in the greenhouse, if we grow it in the greenhouse, it takes 120 days to stratify that seed. So we put it in a Ziploc bag, seed, sand, and water, and basically keep it moist and put it in a refrigerator for 120 days. We'll pop it out, put it in a germination tray in the greenhouse, and it'll germinate like it's green lawn, bluegrass. If we do something less than that, we get 1 or 2. So planting dormantly, planting probably more towards the November, December time with cordgrass is probably more important. Plugs work too. The nice thing about plugs in a reed canary grass problematic areas, it's usually already moist. One of the big problems with plugs is getting them to survive so you don't have to water them all the time. Well, if you're already going into a site that's already moist, you can plant them, water them in, and hopefully the soil's moist enough that they'll survive for a couple weeks, and then usually after a couple weeks they can survive on their own. So
if you were bringing in prairie cordgrass, then we would not be able to use the grass selective herbicide in the spring.
You can, you just have to spray it earlier. So reed canary grass, along with staying green in the fall, greens up really early in the spring. So those are the areas that I either like to do a fall burn on or an early spring burn on. And as soon as that reed canary grass starts greening up in the spring, then you can use your grass selective herbicides on it.
In that situation, you would rather use a grass selective herbicide than another treatment of glyphosate.
Yeah, because then you would have forbs that would be coming up out of the ground in the springtime. So you would be eliminating them. I should say too, one of the downside to glyphosate herbicide is sedges. So sedges stay green year round. So even in the middle of the winter, dig through the snow, those sedge species are still going to be green. And so by spraying glyphosate in the fall, you're going to be eliminating them also. Usually they are pretty prolific seeders that by eliminating that reed canary grass competition, they will come back on their own without an issue though.
Because it seems like, we talk sedges, the river bulrush, which is actually a sedge.
Right.
It seems, that's a really nice one to have that competes well up to a certain segment.
Right.
And once it starts to dry just a little, then so. You've done the spraying glyphosate and you want to add diversity into a prairie. You're doing a dormant seeding.
Correct, yep. It's the best time to get forbs established, doing it dormantly. They all take or most of them take stratification in order to germinate that next spring. So you're giving the forbs an advantage by planting dormantly.
And are you doing that by broadcast method, or do you like to drill in that situation where we already have an existing prairie and you're interseeding?
Can be either way. If you're broadcast seeding, you may want to, if you have all that residue out there, drill may be the better method. If you have it where it's mowed really short and tight, then it may not be such an issue. Where you still can get that good seed to soil contact by that next spring. So
now, I've heard someone talk about if they do the broadcasting and they do it early in dormancy, let's say we're December, they felt like the snow and the rain will get that seed down to that soil layer.
Yep.
And then they're coming in and they're doing an early spring or late winter burn, and they feel like that's not affecting that seed and they're getting rid of the duff layer that way. Have you done that?
I have not done that. I would I'd be a little hesitant to do that. I would just soon have any burning going on prior to planting if you're going to remove it via burning. So I just there could legumes would help them, but I just think of a number of other species that with that fire going through that it'd be pretty tough on them.
If you came in on your dormant seeding and used a drill, would you be concerned about a fire at that point in the spring?
Probably not. The problem with drill is people tend to plant those prairie species too deeply, and that being problematic. So, I would tend to, if you keep that residue out there, probably a drill is the way to go.
Mm-hmm.
But you could, either should work, a drill or broadcast seeding, because if you do a good job of controlling that reed canary grass and it's not there the next spring, even if as long as it's short, a prairie plant should not have trouble coming through that residual cover. If it's this tall, it will have trouble getting through it. But if it's 4 to 6 inches or less, by that next spring, those prairie plants should be able to come right through that. So
once we've got the dormant seeding seeded, now we're into next spring, May and June. You've got this existing prairie growing. Are you utilizing mowing to make sure we're getting light down to those new seedlings that you seeded?
I definitely would mow at least 1 year. Again, I'd let just my normal mowing regime, let that vegetation get to a foot high, foot to 18 inches, and mow it back to 4 to 6. With mowing, the watch out is you don't want it to get so high that when you mow it, you windrow it and leave it over those newly emerging prairie seedlings. But generally that's what I do is follow up that application if I've planted into it with a mowing regime similar to a new planting, what I do for a new planting, but basically mowing for 1 year to get those, especially those early successional species like we were talking about earlier, moist soil species. Generally in 2 years, the second year they're pretty well established, so shouldn't be problematic getting them established just 1 year mowing. So
then 12 to 18 inches tall, we're getting them mowed 4 to 6. So roughly maybe kind of a mowing regime, it's going to depend on the year, but maybe every 3 weeks you're out there?
Yeah. So I would say generally it's 3 to 4 times in a year's time. Definitely probably more towards the 3 weeks early in the year.
Mm-hmm.
When you get to August, it may be a month.
Mm-hmm.
So when it gets a little drier. But again, depending on weather and rainfall, it's really dependent. But that's where I go with the height of the plant versus saying every 3 weeks, because this year that wouldn't have been the case because we had a drought